Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Town of Los Gatos Council meeting of October 16th. Could I have a roll call, please?
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Spector.
Here.
Councilmember Syak. Here. Councilmember Jensen.
Here.
Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Rennie.
Here. All right, at this time, if I could ask my pledge leader to come up and give me a hand. All right, so my pledge leader, we're going to introduce you to everybody. This is Kayla Stagg, and let's see, you are at Nodden Elementary School, and you're entering the 3rd grade. Is that all correct?
Yeah.
Okay, good. It says you like reading, studying, drawing, dancing, swimming, cooking. Boy, I'm tired already. Science, board games. I like board games too. Video games, and scouting. I can see the scouting part, actually. And it says for community service, you volunteer 4 days a week. Wow, that's a lot. 1 hour a day to read to younger children at your previous daycare, and you help to prepare materials that are used at vocational Bible school for the last 4 years. Wow, that's really great. You're a real asset to our community, I can see. Okay, so at this time, if we could ask everybody to stand and join us in the pledge. Our flag's over this way, so go ahead and ask them to join you and start when you're ready.
Can you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yep, go ahead and just start.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great job. Good job. So start down there and shake Marcia's hand and Steve's hand here. And then we have a little treat for you. And then go ahead and shake Mariko's hand. Okay. One more hand for Kayla. Thank you. Okay, at this time, we are going to thank our sponsors from Music in the Park. This year was made possible because businesses from our community and beyond partnered with the town to keep the Music in the Park tradition alive. Our sponsors this year were Bay Area Acting Studio, Arthur Murray, Good Sam Hospital, Purple Onion, Stevens Creek BMW, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, JCC of Los Gatos, Alarm Company, and Hillbrook School, along with the town of Los Gatos, volunteered staff members and funds also. So tonight I'd like to show our appreciation, if I could speak, by providing our partners with a heartfelt thank you. So while some of our partners couldn't make it this evening, I'd like to invite those that are in the audience to come up and introduce yourselves and accept our letter of gratitude. So who is here tonight? Who'd like to come up? Come on up. You get to volunteer, so introduce yourself.
My name's Larry Madrid. I'm the manager at the Purple Onion Cafe right down here.
Perfect. That's the first one I've got. So there's your letter of thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Christy English, and I'm the owner of Bay Area Acting Studio.
All right. Is anybody else here? I guess we only have two with us tonight, so maybe a picture with the mayor. All right, thank you very much. Thank you for supporting our our community. And thank you to all those that were not able to join us tonight for the thank you. Next up, closed session report.
Good evening. Prior to tonight's regular council meeting, council met in closed session to discuss the evaluation of the town manager and the labor negotiations with the town attorney and labor negotiations with the town attorney.
All right, thank you. Next up is council and town manager reports. If we could start with Councilmember Spector, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Over the past 2 weeks, I have met with varying members of our community to discuss their issues of concern.
May I go?
Yes, go ahead, Councilmember Sack.
So since our last public hearing, 2 meetings that I attended on behalf of the town. The first was the Chamber of Commerce's annual awards dinner, which was fabulous. And the second is the Cities Association. One item that we did agree on was a creation of a sub-RENA regional subgroup that we agreed as a town to participate in, and this is to look at our future RENA numbers. So.
And thank you for filling in for me at the Cities Association board meeting. Since our last meeting, I did a ribbon cutting for I didn't do that one. I attended a ribbon cutting for the new professional studies building at West Valley College. That was very interesting. Also, the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority Legislative Ad Hoc Committee met, and I joined them. And I also did a welcome to the new Leadership Los Gatos class, which just started this month for the next year. I guess that's going on 9 months, I think it is. And then I also did a welcome with the Vice Mayor at the Terraces Multicultural Day, which was quite fun, where a lot of the residents all dress in traditional garb of whatever country either they're from or they decided to represent, or they dress as the flag, and they all get to march out with the flag. So that was it for me. Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Since our last meeting, I also attended the Chamber Awards dinner where they picked the Citizen of the Year and the Business of the Year, as well as mentioned by the mayor, the Multicultural Day, which is a fantastic event at the Terraces. I also attended the West Valley Sanitation District Board of Directors meeting. There was no agenda items. Last but not least, I attended the West Valley Clean Water Authority Program meeting, where we interviewed candidates for the district manager position.
Thank you. Councilmember Jensen.
I have nothing to report.
Thank you. Town manager.
Thank you. I have 3 quick items for you. First, on October 17th, we have Coffee with a Cop at Phil's Coffee over at Los Gatos Boulevard and Blossom Hill Road, starting at 7:30 a.m. Also, that same day, tomorrow, Wednesday, the 17th of October at 6:30 p.m., please join us for our first General Plan Update Community Workshop, and that will be at the JCC. And then finally, we are continuing our recruitment for our boards and commissions. Applications are due in 10 days on the 26th of October. In particular, we have openings available at our Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, our Transportation and Parking, Library Board, Historic Preservation Committee, and many others. Thank you.
Thank you. So next up is our consent calendar. I do have cards for items 4, 5, 6, and 8. So that leaves unpulled from the consent 1, 2, 3, and 7. Would any member of council wish to pull any of those items additionally? Seeing none, would any member of the public wish to pull items 1, 2, 3, or 7? Seeing none, I'll come back to the council for a motion. Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Move approval of consent calendar items 1, 2, 3, and 7.
Second.
Any discussion? Any recusals? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anybody opposed? Seeing none, it passes unanimously. Next, I'll go to verbal communications. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to us for 3 minutes on items not on the agenda. I have a couple cards. We'll start off with Brad Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm Brad Davis. I'm the president at West Valley College. I appreciated the mayor's nod to our grand opening ceremony of a couple of weeks ago. You can never predict when you're going to get rain after 8 months, can you? Especially when you have a ribbon cutting outside. But I'm here to talk to you tonight about Measure W, which is our facilities bond, which is on the ballot next month. This is phase 3 of our 3-part educational and facilities master plan at the college. We finished the first 2 parts. But unfortunately, our second bond measure was timed at exactly the same juncture as Apple and a lot of other major projects in the valley. So we are needing this final bond measure to complete the master plan. We've been able to do great work on our student services buildings, our fine arts buildings, our business and professional studies, our campus center. But we've got some other buildings on campus that, if you've been there, are very well loved, as we like to say. And we have some major infrastructure running under the campus that we need to do. So we are asking the public next month to vote on our bond, which is $698 million, which will be split between West Valley and Mission College, our sister district in Santa Clara. The primary thrust of the bond will be infrastructure, but also to complete our library, which is over 50 years old, our community campus wellness center, which will be open to the community, as well as our STEM classroom buildings. Mission College is focusing on a number of other projects like STEM and a fine arts complex as well. This will cost voters $17 per every $100,000 of assessed value, which makes it an incredible value for the money. West Valley College has the highest bond rating that one can attain, and we've actually come in at lower estimates on both of our previous bonds. I know you can't take any action tonight. My goal is to simply apprise you of the measure, hopefully find a way for us to partner in the future on its successful passage, and to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Davis? Seeing none, thank you for coming to see us.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, I have Jack Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm Jack Lucas. I live at 17171 Xena Avenue in Monte Sereno. I'm the former mayor, council member for the city of Monte Sereno, currently a trustee for the West Valley Mission Community College District. The current board of trustees you see on the card, I'm just simply here to reiterate the partnership that the board and West Valley Mission Community College District enjoys with the 7 cities which comprise the West Valley Mission Community College District. Some of these cities are small pieces of the city. I represent trustee area number 5, which includes half of Los Gatos. It's split right down Santa Cruz Avenue, and Winchester on the eastern side is represented by trustee Susan Fish, and I represent trustee area number 5. And I simply, as I said, just want to reiterate, we appreciate the working relationship that we enjoy with all of the cities, particularly Los Gatos. And if you have any questions regarding personal questions for me, I left you my card. Please feel free to call me. I can't speak for the Board of Trustees, but I can certainly share my opinions with you. I've done that more than once, and that's my message.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Lucas? Seeing none, again, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, I have no more cards for verbal communication. Is any other member of the public interested in speaking at this time? All right. John Shepperson, come on up and turn a card in later to the clerk. Later, after.
Thank you for letting me speak, Mr. Mayor. First point, I wanted to commend the council on the Almond Grove streets. They look good, and I think it's also going to enhance the value of those properties, because over time with global warming, those streets are going to keep that neighborhood cooler, and I think that real estate agents can disclose that as part of the sale. So maybe $25,000, $50,000 enhanced in the value of those properties. So I think it's good for global warming and for the town and those properties. Secondly, I wanted to commend the council on the issue of the idea of the Danville like busing program. I think that's really good. I think it's a win-win, and I think that for the community, for traffic, for the schools, the kids, the parents alike. And thirdly, and this is just a little demonstrative piece of evidence in terms of what we put in our windshields of cars. And so I had this idea in terms of the downtown, if we make it one way, or even if we don't, of really sending a message that we are in tune to climate change, that is to possibly the entire North Santa Cruz Street painted either white or light green. And what would it do? It would keep the downtown cooler. It would be a way to, in a small way, but a symbolic way, reduce or address the issue of climate change. And I think also, because we're doing it in Los Angeles, they have a test pilot program going on right now. They stripe the entire street white, and wouldn't cost that much. And just think the national news that they're getting down there for that few streets, the national news that Los Gatos would get if we did that for North Santa Cruz. I think it would be good for business, and it would send a message that we're concerned about climate change, because I believe it relates to those hurricanes that take place back in around the world and in the East Coast. And just parenthetically, why is it that we don't have hurricanes on the West Coast? I did some research on that, and it's simply, as I understand it, the water is so cold that you just don't create the hurricanes. But as the temperature of water increases on the East Coast, we'll have more hurricanes. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Shepherdson? Seeing none, okay, thank you. Don't forget to turn a card into the clerk. And would anybody else wish to speak? I see none. Up. Okay, Larry Maggio, please turn a card in afterwards.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council, staff. I just want to bring attention about the unplanned event that happened at the Blossom Hill overpass. And when that happened, they shut down the road for the day, or that night, and then the day they opened up the westbound traffic. But since then, we've had the eastbound traffic been blocked off, cordoned off, and in the mornings, I don't see too much of a problem with it because I travel down Blossom Hill Road to get to work. But on the way home, yesterday in particular, it took me 1 hour and 5 minutes to get from Pollard Road in Winchester to Roberts Road. What I decided to do is, there was another unplanned event there at Lark. I believe there was a TA at that intersection or close by that intersection, which could have contributed to a lot of backup traffic. But I decided to go down Santa Cruz Avenue to Highway 9 and then cross over to get to Los Gatos Boulevard and head backwards. And that's where the mess really occurred. And so I was thinking about the idea of maybe we should have something in place for signal, a temporary, like they use on Highway 9, temporary signal, where in the morning time we can have the westbound traffic go for the folks that are going to work, and in the evenings it could be timed more for reversing that traffic and allowing the traffic go eastbound on Blossom Hill Road on the north side of the roadway. That's what I want to bring up to the council and see if that's anything possible. I don't know if Matt Morley has looked at it or not, but I think it would benefit reducing the traffic from the unplanned event that we have.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Maggio? Thank you. It might be appropriate to staff give an update on the bridge repair. I know I was asked to help pull strings to move that faster. If you could give us just a short update.
Thank you very much. Matt Morley, Director of Parks and Public Works. And thank you, Mayor, for your help last week engaging with Senator Bell and getting the strings pulled in Sacramento. We had a significant increase in the flow of information. We were hearing crickets for a while there. Caltrans is working on it. They've got a design in place that they're waiting for a director's signature on. That should have happened either today or will happen tomorrow. They have a contractor on board ready to go, so we would expect by Thursday or Friday of this week for them to start work on the repair. It's a couple weeks worth of repair, and then they should be able to open the bridge, assuming they find nothing unusual when they're doing their work. It is an old bridge. It was built in the late 50s, so it's got some weather there under its belt, so that there is a potential for finding surprises along the way. But we do anticipate within a 4-week time frame that roadway will be back open. We do have a frequently asked questions section on our web page under our Public Works Department and Traffic that we share with the community via Nextdoor and through our homepage on the website, and residents should feel free to check that out if they have questions. We've covered a number of ideas, including the traffic signal idea that Mr. Maggio suggested to us, and there's a bunch of other questions on there that are very informative if the residents have questions.
Okay, thank you. All right, anybody else wish to speak to us in verbal communications? Seeing none, I will close verbal communications and come back and work on the consent calendar. Since items 4, 5, and 6 are related, I would suggest that we give a presentation of the 4 items together, and I'll turn that over to staff.
Good evening. Thank you. Lisa Velasco, Human Resources Director. The 3 staff reports before you tonight recommend approval of market equity adjustments for the AFSCME bargaining unit, a labor agreement between the town and the POA bargaining unit, and revision of the classification plans for management and confidential employees. In addition, authority for the associated salary and benefits adjustments in the cumulative amount of approximately $1 million is requested. In summary, staff is recommending market equity adjustments for the AFSCME bargaining unit to maintain parity with the other bargaining units and the unrepresented group. Also, the POA MOU expired on September 30th and is presented tonight for approval with the provisions detailed in the written staff report, which are consistent with the parameters of the other units, such as across-the-board increases and equity adjustments. Finally, staff is recommending that a consistent approach to fit with the overall theme of the salary and benefit structure also be applied to the unrepresented management and confidential classifications, such as across-the-board salary increases and market equity adjustments. Staff recommends acceptance and approval of the recommendations outlined in the 3 separate reports. Approval of the recommendations will also result in the elimination of retiree health benefits and sick leave cash out for all future town employees, resulting in significant future town savings. This concludes my report, and I'm available to answer questions. Staff is also here to support questions from the Finance and Town Manager's Office. Thank you.
Okay, is there any questions at this time for Ms. Velasco? Okay, seeing none, then I will open up the public testimony. Let me check with the town attorney. Can I do public testimony for all 3 at the same time?
Yes, you can.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that, but I will allow them 4 minutes instead of 3 minutes. So let's start with Lee Fago.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Town Council. I am relieved you did pull items 4, 5, and 6 from the consent calendar, as these are each 3-year contracts but only show terms in the agreements for 2 years, of which 1/3 of the first year has already passed. How can you approve, by consent no less, contracts with no specificity for their 3rd year? Perhaps the more logical move would be to only approve a 2-year contract, since those are the only terms provided. Or only approve a 1-year contract, since that is the only specific costing information provided, but not on a consent calendar without proper review. Further, this is the largest line item by value, more than double the next largest expenditure on the town's budget. With no prior review, how can you put this on a consent calendar? Regarding the numbers in the contracts, please note too, since they were not given this evening, that the 2018-19 compensation is now $28,885,000, or just over a $4.2 million increase over 17-18. This is not the 1.2% increase stated in the Measure G ballot measure by this council. Don't consent to this error. I am saying the increase in employee compensations, I'm not saying the increase in employee compensations are wrong or bad. Quite the contrary. I think the town delivers a pretty commendable level of service. But these are not the numbers the town council knows, nor is being communicated into the larger community. Particularly now, the misleading numbers to try to support sales tax Measure G. Besides removing these three items from the consent calendar, not just tonight, but every year going forward, these should not be on a consent calendar. They should be more transparent, expedient, and efficient process to better serve the citizens and the council. I have some suggestions. One, provide the Finance Committee a role in review of the contracts before submitting first to the Budget Committee and only then to the full council. That might preclude such errors or omissions from occurring, which further delays the contracts. Two, completing the contract negotiations in such a timely fashion, perhaps before the budget is submitted to the council for approval, so that there is a better or full transparency and evidence of good fiscal planning for the town. Approving a budget without consideration inclusion of salary increases, and you've already approved a budget, leads to disbursement of erroneous information, evidence of bad planning, and poor management. Three, do not compare budget to budget data, but historical actual to budget to give the correct perspective and expenditures and revenues, so we also know the real balances. A budget to budget comparison is not correct. You need actual historical data to compare going forward. Respectfully.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Fagot? Okay, thank you. Seeing none at this time. Next up, Phil Kiowan.
See if this works. Can everyone see that? Good. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, thank you for allowing me to actually have 4 minutes. That's a real improvement. Appreciate that. I wish I was addressing you on a more positive note. Unfortunately, I'm not. Transparency matters. Facts matter. Honesty matters. We are your neighbors. We expect the town council, the staff, to put forth clear and concise information regarding the budget of this town. I don't think that's too high of an ask. Do you? And what I've shown here is the latest addendum the town manager gave to you yesterday or today, showing you that, in fact, the real budget for salaries and benefits for this town, if you pass this addendum, will be $28,884,000. $28 million. That's a $4 million increase over prior year actual. And yet, what we're told, and constantly told, is that your effect is really only about a 1.2% increase. That's the number. There's some caveats because you kind of put in the fine print, it's budget to budget, but that's the number that you're trying to put out to the public. In reality, it is almost a 17% increase. Not 1.2, 17%. That's the math. And what compounds the problem is that certain members of this council have submitted a ballot argument which have perpetuated this 1.2% mythical increase. And we only find out today that it's truly 17%. What's troubling is that we can see that 1.5 million of this 4 million year-over-year increase is due to salary contracts. I'm trusting that's the right thing to do. I believe that that was probably done in good faith. What isn't so clear to me is where is the balance going to? Where is the incremental excess of 2.5 million that makes up this 4 million increase going to? We don't have more employees. We're roughly flat. You've told us that the budget already included the increase in benefits that were mandated by CalPERS. But no one, and I'm challenging the members of this council, I'm looking at you. Do you understand this? We asked this question of you in June. We got no answer. We asked this question of you tonight. I hopefully will get an answer, because it falls on me. I just can't understand how this body could take action without knowing the truth behind the numbers. So I'd ask you, please explain to the public, how come if we paid $24 million for salary and benefits last year, no increase in people, we now are going to have to pay $28 million? It's a logical question. I look forward to your answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Keown at this time or at all? Okay, thank you very much. Next up, I have Jack Veneta.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council people. You have a major dilemma tonight. You can believe the staff who says that the increase in salaries and benefits is 6.95% when comparing budget to budget, or you can believe that the year-over-year change is really going to be 17% when comparing the actual 2017-18 wages and benefits to the budgeted 2018-19 wages and benefits. You can spend actual dollars. You can't spend budget dollars. If you go to the internet and Google budget to budget accounting or budget to budget as a management tool, you get nothing. I challenge the council to find one good reason to measure performance by comparing one budget to another. The point of accounting is to hold institutions accountable for both the private sector and the public sector. The question is whether managers are creating value. When the management team sets the budget artificially high and then comes in artificially low, they should not be proud of themselves. You can see data manipulation in item 5. How can the council depend on a budget that on the one hand states that there will be a $700,000 surplus and then finds a newly discovered $1.5 million of expenses, and the manager says, don't worry, they can cover it with current revenues? The council should be concerned as to where that spare $800,000 is. It's monetary manipulation. It's one untruth. If there's one untruth, how many more lurk within the budget? When you measure one set of arbitrary budget numbers against another set of arbitrary budget numbers, you get arbitrary results, as evidenced by the tables in item 5. Mayor Rennie, councilpersons Jensen and Leonardis were all given information on the useless data produced by the budget-to-budget comparisons. Yet all three attested to a salary increase of 1.26%, which was in fact much, much larger when you used actual numbers. Telling the public that they were raising salaries 1.26% was pure politics, and they should not be reelected. This is unacceptable data manipulation in Los Gatos. I assure you that our goal will be to educate the public in the difference between fact and fiction. Tonight we'll see which one the council believes in. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Veneta? Seeing none, thank you. I have no more cards on this item. Would anybody wish to? John Shepherdson. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't use up anywhere near the 4 minutes, but I've spoken in the past about the budget and the pension and unfunded liabilities, which are, I don't know, over $50 million. And that alluded to the fact that, as far as I know, that given that the town is in the worst financial condition in its history in terms of the unfunded liability, and how it impacts us on an annual basis, because when you have those liabilities, then by default you don't have those monies for other services in the town. So when I heard very recently, like today, that we have this $1.5 million increase, I was concerned. I don't know all the facts, and I'm going to admit that, but I am concerned about that, and I'm concerned about that in terms of the larger structural debt problems that we have. And the idea of the Finance Committee reviewing things earlier makes sense to me. Maybe perhaps negotiating earlier makes sense to me. In terms of the ballot measure, although I've spoken out against the way the town has managed the money, I believe that it makes sense to actually pass that measure. I think that the town does need that revenue in order to address, pay for present services, as well as perhaps using those funds to reduce the amount of the unfunded liability by paying it down earlier. So I'm not pleased to be able to say that I'm agreeing with it, but I think that it makes sound financial sense at this time, because if we keep kicking the can down the road, as we frankly have done, it's just going to get bigger. So I think we just have to make some tough choices, and the earlier we do that, the better. And I think that, and I would encourage the town to exercise leadership, and it may not be popular to take that stance, but I think in terms of the longer term benefit to the town, that it makes a lot of sense. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Shepherdson? Seeing none, would anybody else wish to speak to us on this item? Seeing nobody rushing forward, I will close the public testimony and come back to council for questions of staff, discussion, motions. Councilmember Sack.
So I'm going to ask question of staff, questions that were answered, that asked today. The 1.5 number that we've confirmed through our desk item, but there was also a question of where the additional $4 million is coming from. So if you could just walk us through how those how the staff provides those calculations.
Okay, so in the addendum that was released yesterday, and thank you for the question, on the middle of page 2 is a small table that explains the salary and benefits in the adopted budget for 17-18, which was $27 million, the adopted budget for the current fiscal year, 18-19, which is a little bit more than 27, and then the adjusted budget with assuming these contracts get approved, and that's what brings us to the $28.8 million. Because we budget for all of our positions at top step, the adopted budgets tend to be a lot higher than the actuals. So that's why in the budgets for 17-18, it was $27 million. And now with the proposal before you, there is a collective addition up to $28.8 million. So if you compare the budgets, the percent change is almost 7%. The reason we don't compare actuals to the budget is because you would be mixing apples and oranges. The actuals look at the actual number of employees, the vacancy rate, et cetera. And that's why we typically have salary savings. So I doubt that when we do the CAFR for next year, our annual financial statement, that in 18-19 we would have spent the full 28.8. In fact, we'll probably come under significantly because we don't have all of our positions filled and we don't pay everybody at top step. So that is why this $4 million is really not a number to be concerned about because you're comparing apples and oranges.
Go ahead, go ahead.
And please just confirm for me that my understanding is that we do our budget with the top step, again, trying to plan for the most expensive budget in case there are additional hires or whatever personnel changes that may occur during the year. We have that budget to accommodate that. Is that correct?
That's right, because we might be able, when we're doing a recruitment, we might find a wonderful candidate, but they have tremendous experience. And in order to bring them in and have them accept our job, we may need to offer them top step right away. So we want to make sure that we have the budgetary capacity to bring the best talent to provide service to the town.
And let me just make sure that's clarified. So we're talking about a position that was open and budgeted for, not an additional beyond what our budget was.
Right.
Councilmember Sayak, go ahead.
And I just have one more question. And I'm not sure exactly how much can be disclosed when we negotiate our contracts in closed session. So I'm going to look to Mr. Schultz. But one of the suggestions was the timely negotiations. And can you just clarify how long our negotiations was? And basically, it is the council's goal as well to have as timely negotiations, and I believe that's the same for the unions. Could you just explain how long it actually took us this year compared to previous years?
Thank you. So this year it took us approximately 6 months. I can't speak for years prior to my arrival, but I believe it took close to 9 months to a year to settle the contracts during the last negotiated contracts.
Go ahead.
And then my final question is, anticipating these are 3 years, how far ahead, given the recommendations, can we foresee in 2 years from now? Do we begin contract negotiations, or is this something that we're on a schedule with our unions on?
We typically begin negotiations 6 months before the contracts expire, giving us ample time to reach agreements prior to the expiration date, which we did with all of our bargaining units this year.
So if I could,
Please, go
I guess
ahead.
I wanted to clarify, given our budget cycles, can you move those up so that you can anticipate when those will close so that you can include it in the upcoming budget? So.
That's certainly something we can look at. We would probably need to negotiate a different time period. So right now, most of our contracts expire on June 30th of the given contract year, with the exception of our police officers union, which expires on September 30th. So if it was the will of the council, we would have to look at a different period, because our budgeting actually starts in January. So that's why we do our priority setting in January. So we start looking at our 5-year forecast. And so in order to know for certain where we are with any new contract, we would have to have expiration dates moved to December. I wouldn't worry about the timing of the budget and the timing of labor negotiations, because when we do our budgeting, we want to make sure that we've got resources available. And this council and councils prior have been very clear that the reason we don't budget in anticipation of an outcome of a negotiated contract is because we don't want to compromise the negotiating process at all. So that is why you see them after the fact and why you are dealing with budget adjustments. So for that reason, we've got resources available, and it is being planned. And at the mid-year budget, you will have an opportunity to look at all expenditures as well as revenues and make any other adjustments that you need to do. And that is our typical budgeting process.
Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To the town manager, circling back to what you were saying, or what you were responding to Ms. Sayak, is it possible to negotiate the labor agreements at such a time frame so that real numbers rather than anticipated numbers are in the budget?
It is possible if the council is interested in changing the period of the contracts. It's not always easy, and I think I don't know if our town attorney would like to add.
If you think of the cycle, no matter when you change it to, because we're on a fiscal year, it's almost impossible unless we conclude negotiations earlier. Actually, when we're ending it on the fiscal year on June 30th is good if we could back it up and somehow get negotiations done early. But if you just change the date, if it's December, you're still going to be in a mid-year time frame no matter which year. With a 2 or 3 or a 4-year or 5-year agreement, the next year, obviously, you'll know what those expenses are going into the budget. You won't have this problem. But all municipalities have this problem with budgeting for employee increases in those off years when they have the negotiations going on. And you don't, as the town manager said, you don't want to put that in the budget because then you're really telling the labor unions exactly where you plan on arriving at.
Go ahead.
Follow-up question. Assuming that the budget does not have the actual actual payment or salary numbers for the reasons that both you and the town attorney mentioned, and it has other numbers, what assumptions does staff make in creating those other numbers?
Well, the budget, and I can see if our budget manager would like to add, but our standard practice is typical of all municipalities. We know what our current head count is. We know what our current expenditures are in terms of salaries and benefits. We take into account the pension obligation. We take into account healthcare increases. And then because we want to make sure that we're going to be able to hire for any vacancy, the basic assumption is for most of our employees, we assume a top step salary for any vacant positions. And then that way, as I mentioned earlier, as we recruit, and if we're successful in finding a great candidate, we're able to bring them on board. All of the assumptions are documented in our budget document, so we do disclose for the public in a transparent way how our budget is put together and what constitutes that salary and benefit line.
What is your understanding of the information that we received this evening and in the past week as to the disconnect between what we, the town and council, have done and what the public perceives?
Well, I can appreciate the concern of the community about the 1.2% increase that is in our published budget document. That was published and adopted in June of 2018. And then all ballot arguments were due in early August. That was about the time that the very first negotiated contract was coming back to council. So it was not possible for us to forecast the results of labor negotiations when budget arguments are being due in early August. So now this is all in the public realm. The public knows exactly that we are now successfully concluded with our labor negotiations, and it is, in fact, a 7% increase. That is disclosed, that is public information. We can't change a ballot argument that has already been published.
So the 1.2% that we had anticipated under the staff's budget is really 7%?
It's 7% if council approves the 3 items before you tonight. But again, it's fully disclosed. Ballot arguments, the ballots are already out. And it was very clear that at the time the ballot argument was written, it was 1.2. So we are not hiding any information. It is very much in the public domain. This is part of government, of being able to take care of town business. The business doesn't stop once ballot arguments are due.
Mr. Mayor, may I do one more?
Please, go ahead.
Why would our town budget anticipate or say 1.2% and then be 7%? Why is there a 6% delta?
So the budget that the council adopted in June looked at the percent change from the prior year, and that was the 1.2%. That was the information that was available at the time. We are now at October 16th. Many months have passed, a lot of work has been done, and we have additional information that has been fully disclosed to the public of Los Gatos.
Councilmember Jensen?
I'm hoping Mr. Schultz will stop me if I'm asking a question that's inappropriate vis-a-vis our closed session obligations. But the agreements that we had before us tonight are the result of many meetings in closed session and extensive negotiation and deliberation with our negotiators, our union representatives, staff, budgeting, where the council established parameters on those contract negotiations, then agreed to a contract to be submitted to the unions. Then the unions voted to approve that contract, and now we come back for a public session basically affirming those agreements based upon the negotiations. If the council were to determine tonight that it was not going to honor those agreements for whatever reason, what would happen vis-a-vis our negotiations and those contracts?
Then there wouldn't be an agreement with any of the employees with number 4, 5, and 6, and we would be back to square one and back in negotiations.
And would we be out of contract with any of those
Yes.
unions? Which ones?
Police?
Yes, the police union, and then we would also not have any kind of comparable market equity increases for our ASME group, nor any compensation adjustments at all for your management and confidential employees.
And finally, any concessions that we negotiated as part of those agreements for health benefits and cash outs would also be back on the table?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. There was an insinuation by one of the speakers that we were trying to sneak something through in consent items. But it's my understanding, being up here for almost 8 years, that we normally go into closed session, we handle labor negotiations, and then we adopt the contracts through consent items. We've always done it that way. And this is the first time that's ever been brought forward, any kind of a concern with that for some reason. So am I thinking correctly, is this is how we always handle it when we bring this item forward in consent?
Typically, it is done on consent, but as with any consent item, whether it's receiving a grant or modifying library hours, the council or a member of public can certainly pull an item for public discussion. The items are, again, fully disclosed. All the reports and information are publicly available, so just because something is on consent does not hide it from the public view.
One more question. So there seemed to be a concern about the 1.2% versus 7%, and I understand the explanation of the ballot statements having to be printed in August. So what if this vote was postponed until the next meeting, which is November 6th? In theory, the ballot language would be correct because we hadn't voted on it yet. Then there would be no misunderstanding, right?
It is the will of the council to decide on these items.
Is that a possibility? Or would that mess up all of the negotiations and deadlines and such?
It's at the will of the council, but I would read the actual language says in that ballot measure. It says the actual budgeted to budget increase was 1.2%, and that's still a true statement no matter what you do tonight, because that's the budgeted amount that was done at that time was 1.2%. We do many times during the year budget adjustments for projects for Almond Grove throughout the year, but that doesn't change the actual budgeted to budgeted amount for that fiscal year.
Thank you. That's the way I understood it as well.
Councilmember Sack.
So two quick questions, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but if nothing were approved today, what unions would be out of a contract?
Our police union would be out of contract.
And all the others, the other union negotiations, we were bringing it retroactively to make it on par. Is that a correct?
That's correct. And I guess I need to clarify, because it's one thing not to act and postpone action versus to reject.
Okay.
And we do have our lead negotiator with us, Donna Williamson, who might have other advice for the council on this matter.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, Ms. Pravetti, I'm Donna Williamson, a senior partner with the law firm of Liebert Cassidy Whitmore. I was your chief negotiator representing the council in these negotiations. I've represented public agencies in labor negotiations in California for over 30 years. I would remind the council that we are governed by the Myers-Milius-Brown Act in these labor negotiations. That's in the California Government Code, and we're required to bargain in good faith within the parameters that are set by the council and consistent with good faith negotiations with the labor associations. We have done that. We've completed that process, which has resulted in a tentative agreement between the town and the unions. The union, your police association, is the one group that doesn't have a finalized contract at this point. They have ratified that. So the only action left to complete this process would be approval or not of the MOU that's before you that is consistent with the direction that was provided. And we possibly could have some issues with the Public Employee Relations Board if we acted inconsistent with those good faith obligations.
Okay, if no other questions, I'd like to ask. Oh, you want to go ahead? Go ahead, Councilmember Spector.
Well, actually, you probably had one to your left, but I'll go ahead. I've heard a lot, I've read a lot, and I've heard a lot this evening of numbers. Ms. Pravetti has clarified the 1.2% to 7%. Are you able to tell me how that translates to numbers, number of dollars, difference between 1.2% and 7%?
So if you look at your addendum, again, on page 2, the 1.2% is actually calculated right there, so you can see the difference between the 2017-18 adopted budget and the 2018-19 adopted budget. They're both roughly about 27 million, but it does go up slightly, so that's the percent change of 1.2. And then the third column with numbers shows the adjusted 2018-19, and if you compare the column that's labeled A to C, that brings you to the 7%. So you have the actual numbers there, 27 versus 28.8%, 28.8 million, and that brings you to the 7.
It's basically 2 million?
Well, again, it's comparing the adjusted of roughly 2 million, a little bit under.
Thank
2
you.
million.
Okay, so I'll ask my question, which is kind of a suggestion, but in the form of why can we not? Ever since I got on council and been looking at budgets, one of the things that's bothered me is when we look at budget, we have actuals for years back, actual, then it goes last year's actual, last year's budgeted, this year's budgeted. And I like to, and others like to draw a graph to show you the trend. And we want to be the most, what's the trend with the coming budget? And the problem is the budgeted is never what actually happens. So what my suggestion on why could we not is if we went back for many years, we could calculate a percentage of what is the actual come in under budget for many years, and that can give you, some confidence level of what next year's actual, the year that you're budgeting, what its actual might be. I know that finance doesn't like to do that because it's numbers guessed in the future, and I know you can't do it on a CAFR where you have, a specific format you have to follow. But in our budget, we could put in something like that, or we could put in some extra graphs to help show based on. You could even do a error bar or something based on past 4 years or something, this is the percentage that the actuals come in below budgeted. So you have a feel for what is, based on this budget, what are we really talking about for an actual, and then we can draw graphs to get a feel for what is our trend that's going on. I don't know how many discussions I've had where people have tried to compare budgeted to actual and it doesn't work. So any response to that?
Gita Ungvari, Finance and Budget Manager. The town manager already explained how we budget for the different FTEs. We budget most of the FTEs stop-step, and we don't. We budget the vacant position as well. So what you are describing is probably building a vacancy factor that we can probably run and add an analysis in our financial summary section and the FTE, and then we can show what can be our potential saving based on our historical information.
I think that would be helpful. I know the danger is if council sees, we're going to have this saving, we'll be spending it before we actually save it, which is not good. So we need to save it first, but it does help with what the trends are. Okay, any other questions from council members? Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I was going to make a motion to approve consent items 4, 5, and 6 based on the fact that we have some really good employees who deserve to be paid. It's tough to find good talent. This town demands very high services. I don't want Paul Blarth, mall cop, patrolling our streets. I appreciate Mr. Queen and Mr. Von Nadel's comments, but I feel like this isn't voodoo economics here. I think a proper representation was put forth. I think we need to move forward on this subject. So my motion is to approve consent items 4, 5, and 6.
Councilmember Jensen?
I'm going to second the motion because we have, in fact, engaged in lengthy negotiations with each of our unions in good faith. We need to make sure that we follow through on those agreements that they voted on, and we owe it to our employees to follow through on those agreements that they are relying on, and it's the fair and right thing to do.
Okay, further discussion? Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to thank those of you who have written in and talked with us and spoken, because even though I generally find the budgetary process fairly understandable, and it actually interests me, and I actually read all that stuff, the information that many of you have given us has been very helpful. And I've learned from you. I've learned things like, well, maybe in the future we shouldn't be comparing budget to actual. Maybe we should have apples and apples rather than apples and oranges. Maybe we shouldn't be looking at percentages versus dollar signs. Maybe we should be looking at, again, apples to apples. Maybe we shouldn't be looking at vacancies that should be budgeted that could be filled and might not be. As I'm listening to those of you in the audience and those of you up here, those are just some of the issues that have made the budgetary process less than clear to the community and probably to us. So I'm hopeful that I understand that the government and the bureaucracy has a way of doing things, and that the town could very well or has been doing it that way, but it's not the clearest way. So I'm hopeful that next year and in years in the future, it will be clearer. Having said that, I agree with the motion in the sense that we have been involved in these negotiations for many months. We have come to a conclusion, and it needs this vote. And so within that parameter, I will be supporting the motion.
Councilmember Sack.
Okay. I think one of the key takeaways that I heard today was that the transparency in how we're spending your finances is very important. And so I appreciate that, and I applaud everyone that's taking a look at these finances. I think one of the key parameters when we went into union negotiations, and I'll just speak for myself, is we were looking at how do we provide cost of living increases, which is so important for our staff, but also how to look at positions that are not equitable to the median of what other salaries are in the Bay Area. We acknowledge that we have great staff, and to keep that staff, we have to pay them well. And we have to make sure that we're not the highest, we're not the lowest, but we have to be fair. And so with that lens, we did what we did in good faith during negotiations. I think this was a record for us, and it was a 6-month negotiation. I'm proud of what we were able to negotiate, and I think what we have before us shows that. And again, I think in the end, the lesson and the biggest takeaway is that we need to show, and there's lots of lessons suggested, but any more suggestions that you can provide, Mr. Fagot, I appreciate the suggestion you provided. How to better explain how finances are being spent is always worthwhile, and I appreciate all the suggestions made today.
Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I want to echo the comments of Councilmember Spector and Councilmember Sayoc. A lot of great information was brought forward, but I also want to make one more comment. Being on this council for a good number of years and working alongside this professional staff, there was no attempt made to mislead the public or lie to the public or disguise numbers from the public. Now the public is facing an election, and you can vote accordingly, read the ballot arguments. We're all entitled to vote, but I can guarantee you, and I think you can see, that these council people up here are very forthright people elected by the majority of the voters in Los Gatos. And I think that accusations are a little bit unfounded.
And I will just add a little bit, since nobody else, I'll just add a little bit. In these negotiations, we gave some and we got some. We went in with the idea that we wanted to find ways to limit our pension liabilities, and we made some progress on that with the elimination, with this vote, if it passes tonight, we'll eliminate OPEB liabilities in the future for future employees. That will quickly add up to a lot of savings, maybe even equaling what we gave. And we also got the police department to agree to pay an extra 3% of the pension costs. So in both of those, those were things that we were looking for. We heard from the public over and over, we're worried about pension liabilities, and we went after those things in our negotiation, and you had to give a little bit in order to get those. So if nobody else wishes to comment, I will call a question. All in favor? Aye. Anybody opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Velasco. So next up, we have agenda item number 8.
You want me to go ahead with the staff report?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, and the item is the approval of an exclusive negotiating agreement with Sarah Chaffin to develop the affordable teaching housing at 20 Dittos Lane. Back in September 2017, council had this on their agenda and discussed the disposition of the property and directed staff to go out and encourage parties and developers to submit proposals as to the property, and you gave parameters of a number of units and affordability requirements on that property. It then came back to you in February of 2018, and we had 5 proposals in front of you, which you evaluated those proposals, and you narrowed it down to 2, the Habitat for Humanity proposal and the support teacher housing proposal, and wanted to flesh out a few other issues regarding easements and some other parameters of their proposals. It came back on May 1st of 2018 to you, and at that time you directed staff to move forward with an exclusive negotiation agreement with the support teacher housing and Sarah Chaffin. That agreement now is in front of you for approval tonight.
Okay, questions, Councilmember Spector?
Thank you. This is a little tiny question. On your draft agreement, page 3, at the very bottom, at least my draft, says error, exclamation point, R. Is that on yours? That's probably supposed to be something else. Yes. Do you know what it's supposed to be?
It shouldn't be in there at all, I think if you could just cross that out, that would, I mean, let me get to it, it's coming up right now.
What page was that?
Yeah, it should just end at financial information, there
Great.
should be a period there. Described in error R, referenced source not found, shouldn't be in there at all.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? All right, seeing none, I will open up the public testimony. I have a card from Gerald Scott, if you'd like to address us for 3 minutes.
Mr. Mayor, Town Council, I asked 6 months to resolve the easement issue. Since the town paid $3.2 million for this property, the highest and best use is more than 4 units. I believe with resolution of the easement, I can provide more affordable housing than 4, and I believe that I am entitled to some, from you, a little time to resolve this. You've seen my proposals in the past. I believe that it is the highest and best use for the property, and I ask you to vote on this for me to just give me 6 months. That's all I have to say.
Okay, questions for Mr. Scott? Seeing none, thank you. Would any other members of the public wish to address us on this item? Seeing none. Oh, what? Okay, come forward, Lee Fago.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. I was not going to, as you could tell, speak to this issue. I am a little concerned in giving one person a 1-year exclusive negotiating period. It has already been, I believe, 4 months or longer since you had selected that individual to try to develop that property and come back with a proposal. Adding another year to that, I think, is a waste of time. I would say a 6-month negotiating period from today would make more sense. And the reason is that land is sitting there undeveloped. It's cost the town millions of dollars. And unless some action is taken to develop the land, regardless of whether it's the mix of affordable, unaffordable, market rate, whatever, I think that would be a better use of the time and the town's money, its investment. It's a resource that's unique, it's novel, and it should be considered as such and optimized as such. I think it's a noble gesture to say it would be teacher housing, but I'm not sure how that would come about. I've listened to a number of proposals on how to deal with that, and in fact, the school districts are not in a position, they've indicated they're not in a position to they themselves become landlords or to try and manage the property with housing, to try and find a third party who would either purchase or lease the land, develop it, and then manage it on an ongoing basis is, I think, something that's going to take different resources to put in place, and I think it's going to take, it's not going to come to fruition. Don't give more time than is reasonable. I think 6 months is a reasonable time for Sarah to put together the organization that's necessary to come back with a decent proposal that the town would be willing to accept. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Fago? Seeing none, thank you. Okay, I have one more person whose name I don't know, so please introduce yourself.
Vice Mayor and Town Council members. My name is Diana Hill. I am a teacher at Van Meter Elementary. I'm also the president of the Elementary Teachers Association. I'm speaking tonight on behalf of the teachers of Los Gatos. As you know, about a quarter of the teachers in my teachers association commute. So for us personally, having some housing secured here in support of teachers would keep the talent. It's something we're facing in our schools today is we have no problem recruiting the talent, but teachers tend to leave pretty quickly because they cannot afford to live here. So I thank the Town Council for your support of teachers in our community, and I'm here tonight in support of our teacher housing program, and in particular the proposals that Sarah Schaffen has presented to the Town Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Hill? Seeing none, thank you for speaking. I have no more cards. Would anybody else wish to speak to us on this item? Seeing none, I will close the public testimony and come back to council. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. I believe this is a question of the town attorney. In section 1.2 of the agreement, that is where you reference the 1 year. Considering the testimony that we just received, and also considering your experience with this concept, do you think 6 months is okay, or should it remain 1 year?
I believe 6 months would be just too short of a period. As the speaker mentioned, there are complicated issues that need to be fleshed out to make sure they can happen. One being the teacher housing and being exclusively for teachers, or how it's going to fall under our affordable housing agreement language in our policy. So there's a lot to flesh out there. It also has to go through the regular policy. It goes through the regular planning process by going to the Planning Commission or the DRC and even to this council. So I don't believe you could do it in 6 months. I think even 1 year would be cutting it short. That's why I give an extra 6 months that it can be continued past that date with the town manager's approval. So,
Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Move approval, consent item 8.
Okay, I have a motion. Do I have a second? Councilmember Sack.
I'll second the motion, and I appreciate the comments of looking at the cost effectiveness of the land. But I think how long we've been in discussion on Ditto's Lane, I think we have a viable solution that we've already discussed multiple times in this hearing, and I'm looking forward to having more teachers stay in our community.
Okay, any further, I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anybody opposed? Passes unanimously. All right. We've finished our consent calendar. And I have a request for a 5-minute break. Looks like we're ready. Let's go ahead and get started. So we're on item number 9. So I'll turn it over to staff to give us a report.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, council members. Before you tonight is consideration of an amendment to chapters 6 and 29 of the Town Code regarding fences, hedges, and walls. This matter was last reviewed by the council on December 5th, 2017, and during this public testimony, alternative language was introduced by a community member to address concerns of the council and the public. Council discussed the draft ordinance and the alternative and continued the matter to a date uncertain. In the time since this meeting, staff has worked with multiple members of the public to refine the draft ordinance being presented to you tonight. The revised ordinance continues to separate the town into non-hillside and hillside properties with regards to fencing. The non-hillside properties would continue to be regulated in a similar way to the current ordinance. Properties located in the hillside would be divided into 2 zones based on lot size, the unregulated fence area and the regulated fence area. A permit would be required for fences in the regulated fence area, and fences would be subject to regulations related to siting, design, materials, dimensions, and wildlife friendliness. The draft ordinance continues to include a proposed increase to the maximum height for fences in the non-hillside areas of the town from 6 feet to 7 feet, with the top foot being lattice. This was a request made by a community member to the Planning Commission. Additionally, the draft ordinance includes setback requirements for vehicular gates throughout the town. Staff recommends the council review and discuss the draft ordinance and introduce the ordinance affecting the amendments to the town code. This concludes staff's presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions at this time? Go ahead, Councilmember Sack.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen. So last time this was before us, there were several community members that had not seen a copy of what was in front of us. You mentioned that you've heard from several people since preparing this. Does that include members of the community that were in attendance at that last meeting?
Yes, some of the people that we worked with over the last 6 or 7 months were at the last meeting.
If I could maybe ask that question in a different way. Last time there was members of the public that were interested in non-hillside changes, and it seems like you worked with them. So the real question is, how many members that were concerned about it have you worked with? Let me rephrase, that were concerned about the changes to the hillside fence portion. How many have you worked with that were concerned about it?
1.
Okay. Councilmember Spector.
Let me follow up on that. And the reason you worked with 1 or only 1 was because?
They were interested in working with staff and Dr. Weissman on drafting an ordinance that was more agreeable to the greater town. There were other community members that checked in, but we only worked with 1 that had concerns at the last meeting.
And was there anyone who had concerns and wanted to talk with you with whom you did not engage?
No.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, seeing none, I will open public testimony. We'll start off with Peter Donnelly.
Good evening, council members. My name is Peter Donnelly, and I live at 15305 Seaview Drive in Los Gatos, and I'm the one individual that participated in this process. By the way, I represent 6 other neighbors who have seen the latest proposal and have provided their support. I spoke at the previous council meeting where the original proposal was discussed and was against that proposal. As I'm sure you're aware, there was a lot of pushback from many other people who spoke at that meeting. Much of this feedback revolved around the highly restrictive nature of the proposed wording for the ordinance that would have essentially limited fencing of any type in the hillside area to within 30 feet of the primary residence. No consideration was given to the size of the properties or existing wildlife passages. In the spirit of cooperation, I agreed to work with Mr. Weissman co-author of the original proposal, to see if we could arrive at a mutually agreeable proposal with specific focus on the hillside area and not the flatland. We worked through the various sticking points that existed and have come up with something that I believe the residents of Los Gatos will see as fair and balanced, with the exception of one item. Both Mr. Weissman and I believe the document should include language that would eliminate any disconnects or conflicts between the ordinance language and any CC&Rs for planned developments in the hillside area. Please refer to the joint letter from Mr. Weissman and I in your packet regarding the recommended additional language. I can confirm that 6 of my immediate neighbors have seen the revised and latest proposal and are now all supportive of the proposal in front of you. I encourage the Town Council to support the proposal before you for the new fence ordinance as adjusted for the one item that I've referenced. Thank you for your time.
Okay, questions for Mr. Donnelly? Councilmember Sack.
Mr. Donnelly, I appreciate the time that we've spent towards this. One of the letters that we received was a request to change the material so that any, I think it was see-through material.
I saw that in the desk item. I think that's a great suggestion. I can't imagine anybody doing a see-through restricted, wildlife-friendly fence, but let's try and avoid that happening.
Okay, thank you.
I have one question for you. The document uses 1 acre as kind of the break point for if you have an acre, it doesn't apply to you if you're smaller than an acre kind of thing. And it's a nice round number, but is it the right number?
I'll leave that for council to determine. We wanted to try and not infringe upon those people that have smaller lots in the hillside, but also for those that have larger lots to provide a suitable area where the fencing is much lower, but not restrict their use of their land. I have a 4.3 acre lot. The original proposal provided for me to be restricted to 30 feet from my house. So I would have had approximately 4+ acres of land that I couldn't do anything with or have any fencing of any sort on. And that's crazy. So 1 acre is an arbitrary number. It seemed logical for the size.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no further questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, I have David Weissman.
Most of you appreciate what a long effort this has been and how much compromise has occurred. As a community member, I appreciate the council letting me work with staff. I think we now have a better work product, and I ask that you approve the draft before you with the addition of 1 sentence. And that 1 sentence is, when a conflict exists between the CC&Rs of a hillside PD and this document, the requirements of this document shall prevail. Simply put, the town's rules should take precedence in this situation. This exact same line was in the last draft that was before you on December 5th, 2017, and there was no audience or town council opposition. Staff subsequently removed it, this line, and I ask that you reinstate this sentence tonight. Why? Because inadvertently, such conflicts can occur. For instance, the CC&Rs of the Highlands show a rail-type fence, as here, but with animal unfriendly wire mesh. Incorporating the above proposed sentence into the town's fence ordinance ensures that homeowners associations will continue to advise their members and update their internal CC&Rs, since any proposed fence or wall construction usually has to be approved by the homeowners association governing body. I also believe the addition of this wording would remove any ambiguity and prevent any unintended loopholes that result in fencing that does not comply with the intended goals of the Hillside Design Standards. Someone asked about the letter that was included about transparent building barriers. I also support that. I can't imagine anyone doing that, but in case someone does, such transparent barriers would be a danger to low-flying birds such as quail. And at the previous meeting, December 5th, since this was brought up before, there were some 12 members of the audience that spoke out against the draft that was before you. Most of them were up on Sioux View, where Mr. Donnelly lives. It was their concerns and concerns from other members of the audience that stimulated us, if you will, to go back and work for this compromise. And we now have it, and I think it's great. It's not perfect, never is. That's what a compromise is. And I hope that you support it tonight.
Thank you. Let's see if you have any questions. Councilmember Sack.
So, Dr. Weissman, question with regard to the research that you did. In our desk, in our packet, we also have some material from Saratoga and Montessorino. Did you, when doing your research, did you look at those regulations? And so that's the first question. And then any thoughts on that?
I have not. I just saw the information in the desk item. Mr. Mullen was the one that did most of the research. I looked at Woodside, Portola Valley, and actually places in Wyoming and Colorado to get their input on what they had actually passed for fence ordinances. I think Sean would be the better one to comment upon local ordinances.
Okay, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Weissman. Next up, I have David Klinger.
I'm David Klinger. I'm here to talk about the other half of the, which is the non-hillside ordinance on the fence heights. The letter that is in the packet there, I believe, explains the arguments, and I won't repeat those. I think this is a good time, by passing this, to align the ordinance to the prevailing norm of the city and to eliminate a very widespread noncompliance to the code. I think it's good law, and I think you should support it just based on the lack of enforcement that currently is there, and the generally acceptance of the neighbors for this 6-foot plus 1-foot lattice. Higher up on the hillside, I was very encouraged to see the report there. I think this was a good effort of the community trying to work together to strike the right balance between our natural habitat, the setting that we have here, and the property rights of the citizens there. So I believe that this also is a good draft that was resulted from that effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no questions, thank you. All right, next up I have Alice Kaufman.
Good evening, Mayor and Council members. My name is Alice Kaufman. I'm with Committee for Green Foothills, and we're an organization that works to protect open space and natural resources in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. And together with the Audubon Society and Sierra Club, we did submit a letter in support of this ordinance. This is obviously a compromise ordinance, greatly modified from what was before you last year. As a quick summary, the requirements for the wildlife-friendly fences only apply to lots that are larger than 1 acre, and on those lots, they only apply to the area within between 20 to 30 feet of the edge of the property. And that also only applies to new or modified fences, nothing's going to happen to existing fences, or if those existing fences need to be repaired, there's no changes required. And so in that narrow perimeter area, homeowners may construct fences that are wildlife friendly, meaning animals can climb under, jump over, or pass through, and that are no more than 42 inches tall. So basically, homeowners on these lots larger than 1 acre, remember it doesn't apply to anything 1 acre or smaller, can build any type of fence other than barbed wire or razor wire, as long as those fences are set back from the edge of the property between 20 to 30 feet, depending on whether it's front, side, back. So the purpose of having this, I'm calling it a setback, this sort of perimeter area, is basically, one of the main reasons is to keep animals out of the roadways. In these hillside areas, lots of times, you have these very narrow winding streets, no sidewalks or often any shoulders. And when there are impassable fences that are built right on the edge of the road, what's going to happen is you're going to get deer and other animals in the road where they pose a serious risk of collision to vehicles, not to mention that the animals get hurt and killed. Building fences to exclude animals when you're out in these hillside areas, it doesn't keep them from trying to get through, it just forces them into the road, and that's not a situation that anybody wants. A lot of homeowners, move out into these hillside areas precisely because they value the beauty of nature and they enjoy being able to see animals frequently. So when we do build our communities in areas where there's habitat, it does become necessary to try to reduce human and animal conflict to achieve a balance where we can still enjoy the nature that is so important to us, while also, allowing homeowners the freedom to do as they like with the parts of their property. There were a lot of comments last time about people saying, what about a vegetable garden? What about a kid's play area, and so on. And so unless somebody, really who lives on a lot that's larger than an acre really has to have their vegetable garden right next to the road, then this is not going to hamper anything that they're trying to do with their property. This is just allowing a sort of strip along the edge of the property for animals to pass through. Thanks.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you. Okay, next up I have, I'm going to have to put on my glasses, Dashiell Leeds.
Good evening, Mayor Rennie and council members. My name is Dashiell Leeds, and I live in the Los Gatos Hills. I am a volunteer with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society's Environmental Action Committee, and I am here to speak as both a lifelong resident of Los Gatos and a representative of Audubon. Our organization is strongly supportive of wildlife-friendly fencing and has been following the progress of this ordinance in town for a while now. We urge you to adopt the draft ordinance before you with one minor amendment, and this is the amendment that we've discussed with the October 14th letter. Please add transparent fences, such as barriers of glass or clear plastic, to the list of fence types that are prohibited under section 29.40.034B2A. Transparent barriers, such as see-through glass walls and clear plastic, are hazardous for birds, who often collide with such barriers because they do not see them or they see a reflection of trees or water. These called bird strikes are a major problem in the wildland-urban edge. Transparent fencing has the potential to significantly damage bird populations. Migratory birds are vulnerable to these barriers, and so are many of our resident birds, such as the California quail, the dark-eyed junco, the California towhee, and other species. With this small amendment, you can take a great step to protect these bird species that are crucial to our ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for this speaker? Seeing none, thank you very much. Next up, I have Lee Quintana.
Lee Quintana, 5 Palm Avenue. I really didn't expect to be able to be here tonight, so I really am not totally prepared to speak, and I've been pretty worn out by the experiences that I thought I wasn't going to be here for. But I do want to comment that I agree with the Sierra Club, the Audubon Club, and the Committee for Green Hillsides, all club organizations that I belong to, for the need to have migration movement court, movement corridors for animals in the hillsides. Those organizations all agreed to to recommend approval of the first original draft as well as this current draft. I see that as the major problem is that the first draft was balanced too far in the direction of the animals and the openness and rural character of the hillsides, whereas this compromise draft, I believe, has flipped too far in the balance of the hillside property owners. And it no longer really, in my opinion anyway, meets the goals, policies of the general plan or the hillside design standards and guidelines, specifically the regulations for fences and for minimum fencing and maximum preservation of wildlife habitat, as well as movement corridors and the rural open space of the hillsides. Another major problem I see with this current proposal, aside from those policy ones, is that the major criteria for dividing into two groups is based not on zone but on lot size. However, within those two lot sizes, the ones above 1 acre, it's one size fits all for no matter how big the parcel is. I just want to also point out that I was not involved, not time to say that, that there are several problems, I believe, even within the organization, that there's no maximums or heights for the vehicle gates. There's riparian habitat setbacks are only for the acres over the lots over one acre, and
Okay, let's
sorry.
see if you
I
have
just-
questions. Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Obviously, I'm a little nervous tonight.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Ms. Quintana, so you raised a number of concerns based on what you've mentioned to me. It sounds like you think that this might need to go to a rework pile.
I think that's what I suggested in my letter, that it go back to the policy committee to look at again, and both from the organizational standpoint and from what is a better balance between the two. I totally agree that the use of 30 feet from the residence is far too restrictive, but I also do not agree that if you have a 5-acre parcel, it's only 30 acres in front and 20 acres on the side, that it's restricted to animal friendly.
Go ahead.
Do you agree with the comments which were made about the clear glass or the plexiglass affecting the birds, as well as the comment from the speaker about bringing the overall fence ordinance to a 7-foot height?
Absolutely.
Everywhere?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I also would state one other thing that I stated in my letter, based on best practices. I would also ask the policy committee to look at the front yards setbacks for all houses in Los Gatos, and as to whether it's appropriate to have 6-foot solid fences in a front yard setback for any house.
Thank
and
you.
that's common in practically every single district, every jurisdiction I looked at.
Okay, let me ask a question. You said you had concerns about one size fits all or two size fits all. Can you explain how would we do that different?
Well, I don't know, but I do think that in the hillsides, to simply say everything more than 1 acre should be treated the same in terms of the area that is animal friendly does not make sense, because some of the lots are so much larger. I don't have any problem with saying that areas less than 1 acre meet the less than the acre requirements, except that I do have concerns that if that means that they can have fences along their property lines on the sides and the back, that will limit the number of hillside and larger lots that could be, would not have corridors provided. But no, I don't have any problem with not all sizes have to be equal, but I do think there probably should be, we should look at a better division of it in the hillsides, more division of it in the hillsides, and set those based on the size as well as other criteria.
You also mentioned that the organization wasn't right. What did you mean by that?
What I meant by that is that I found it very confusing to read, and I'm trying to read it both for myself, and I know I have more knowledge than most people, but also just as a general person. And I was having problems because the division, the basic divisions were between the hillside and the non-hillside, and yet the actual standards and regulations were based on size, not zoning. And so they didn't fit into the non-hillside, hillside categories anymore, and I don't think it was really clear what regulations went with what without having to really sit down and try and figure it out and very carefully read the definitions and go back and forth and back and forth. And then even with the definitions, some of them just don't seem to make sense anymore. They're not quite accurate. And standards that I thought would apply to both, should apply to both non-hillside or less than 1 acre and more than 1 acre in this ordinance don't necessarily apply to them all, like setbacks for riparian habitat. That's one that I can think of off the top of my head. And there's no standard set for the height.
I think we get it. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, I'm really tired.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Can I just add one more thing?
Shortly.
If you choose, which I hope you don't, to accept this draft in principle, I would request that you still send it back either to staff or the policy committee to reorganize it and make sure that it's easily understandable. To me, transparency means the average person being able to understand something without having to get interpretations from staff. Thank you for the extra time.
Okay, thank you. Next up, I have Bruce McComb.
It's a photograph from our front yard, and I just wanted to share it with you.
Could you raise the microphone up a little too?
Sorry, guys. Haven't been here for a while. That's great. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Rennie and Town Council members. Thanks for allowing me to speak tonight. My name is Bruce McCombs. I'm here in support of the proposed amendments to the town's current ordinance regarding fences, hedges, and walls, specifically as they pertain to hillside properties. My wife, Jackie, and I have lived in our home on Kennedy Road in the Los Gatos foothills for a little more than 40 years. Our house is located on a hillside just above Kennedy Meadows near Teresita Way. Our property has several paths that deer, quail, and other wildlife in our neighborhood have created over the years. They use these paths nearly every day as they make their way down from the hillside above our house to the meadow across Kennedy Road. The photo on the screen was taken from our driveway last summer. The doe and the fawn shown here are standing on one of the paths that run through our property. My wife and I have enjoyed this scene nearly every day in one form or another for the past 40 years, and it's in these moments we feel so very fortunate to be able to call Los Gatos our home. I'm here this evening on behalf of this doe and her fawn, who unfortunately weren't able to attend this evening's meeting. On a slightly more serious note, I'd like to take a few moments to address what I believe are the very dangerous effects that steel and chain link fences have on the deer and other wildlife living in our hillsides, most especially young fawns who in their first few months of life are just learning to negotiate our neighborhoods. One of the most heart-wrenching events I've witnessed, and I'm sorry to say I've experienced this several times over the years, involves a doe on one side of a neighbor's chain link fence and her fawn stuck on the other side right next to Kennedy Road. With cars zooming by, the fawn is frantically dashing back and forth in front of the fence trying to get to her mother. One wrong move and she's finished. An ordinance requiring wildlife-friendly fences on many hillside properties would certainly reduce the likelihood of occurrences similar to the one I've just described. The second photo I'd like to share with you is one I came across while doing a bit of research on the many ways that wildlife-friendly fences can benefit the environment. By the way, I apologize to anyone who might feel uncomfortable in viewing this photograph. So we can see in the photo a young buck has caught his hind leg in the top of a chain link fence. So I hope that everyone here would agree steel and chain link fences really don't belong on our hillsides. I'm encouraged to know that our town is considering a proposal to help to protect the wildlife-friendly corridors that have existed in our hillside for hundreds of years by eliminating the future construction of steel and chain link fences on many hillside properties. I believe that the proposed amendment to the town's fence ordinance will provide a major benefit to the well-being of the many different species of wildlife living on our hillsides. I'm asking the mayor and town council to please vote in favor of this amendment.
Thank you.
Very much.
Any questions for Mr. McComb? Seeing none, thank you.
Thanks for being here, guys.
Next up, I have Don Wimberly.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. My wife and I, our family, have lived in the HR zone for 42 years, have become very familiar with wildlife. We provide numerous wildlife corridors, nesting areas, resting areas, shady areas, and we fully support the citizens of Los Gatos who have great sensitivity and concern for wild animals. We also, however, support the rights of property owners and the inherent ability of property owners to make good decisions about their own properties. Certainly a property owner with 4.3 acres of land in a fairly steep area, as Sioux View is, are able to do things that other property owners are not. You have my comments in your packets, so I'd refer to those. We have concerns both about some content of the ordinance and also the process. I had no idea that town staff and some proponents have worked on this for a year and a half. In the time frame of the December 2017 hearing, there was a Change Me petition which was circulated, had a great amount of opposition to the ordinance, but yet I find no mention of that in the record of the 2017 hearing. I'm concerned about the process. I know my neighbors, the only reason my neighbors know is I happen to pick this up from the local newspaper and relayed information about it to them. Again, I'm not sure why that petition of 2017 received no mention either verbally by the associate planner or in the packet. If council were to adopt this, I believe it's essential that you send a copy of the ordinance and a notice to each hillside residential property owner. The lack of people here tonight demonstrate that this ordinance was developed by a few people and town staff. Examples of some inequities. We have, what if I had a 1.1 acre lot? Am I not in a different situation than the gentleman with the 4.3 acre lot and steeper environments? That single threshold does not recognize the truth of the Los Gatos hillsides and its topography. Some property owners need to keep their animals in. Some property owners need to keep their the wild animals out. Coyotes and other animals are frequent visitors to our property, and the ability to have play area for children is important.
Thank you. Let's see if you have any questions.
We recommend strongly a vote against this or a continuation to allow participation by more hillside owners. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any more cards. Does the clerk have more cards? It didn't make it here. Yeah. Bill, I saw Bill Hirschman give a card, but did I lose it? Well, feel free to speak anyway.
Thank you. My name is Bill Hirschman. Good evening. I'm really not prepared to, I'm sorry.
I found it.
Oh. I'm really not prepared to talk about the specifics of the ordinance because honestly, I just was made aware of it by Mr. Wimberly about a week and a half ago that there was going to be a hearing. I was out of town last week. So I find myself fairly savvy with regards to town process, but I was totally unaware that this ordinance, or draft ordinance, was even coming up in front of the council again. I agree with Mr. Wimberly and Ms. Quintana that I think what needs to happen is this be continued and give people like myself who were totally unaware of this some time to certainly sit down and participate in that conversation. I knew nothing about this. I feel quite strongly that there's some major errors in what's being presented. Mr. Mayor, you pointed out one of them. Several other speakers have discussed the magic 1 acre limit. There are many procedures in town, being a developer, that we go through to the point where we specifically specify what plants are going to be planted, where every retaining wall is going to be, where every wall is going to be, where every fence is going to be. There's a process we go through in these developments where there's many opportunities to discuss fence heights, fence designs, fence setbacks, riparian areas. All of this is already part of the planning process. So to load kind of an arbitrary baggage on top of this that is specific, it may be specific to one lot, but not to another. For example, a 1.1 acre parcel with a significant riparian setback, in my personal opinion, would be quite different from a 1 acre parcel that potentially doesn't have that kind of requirement. I think there's some fairly major gaps. The only other thing that I can tell you just from my personal experience is that I'm a hillside resident. We have hillside neighbors. None of them were aware of the previous, and when we would at gatherings explain to them the ordinance that was being proposed, it was almost kind of a dumbfounded reaction. That something like that would even be in the process. I agree with Mr. Wimberly. I think that because this town is always has been so open with regards to notification, that hillside residents should be notified. I knew nothing about it, so I can only imagine other people that maybe aren't as quite savvy in the process. So I would respectfully ask that you continue this, maybe have some discussion, but certainly continue the conversation to another meeting and notify hillside residents.
Thank you. Let's see if there's any questions for you. Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Mr. Hirschman, as you might have picked up on, there's been some members of the community that have been actively involved with this for some time, and there's certain points of view about the wildlife, and as you mentioned, parcel sizes and such, riparian corridors, et cetera, are you interested in perhaps contributing your information? I mean, you have an extensive amount of development experience and familiarity with a lot of the town codes and ordinances. Would you like to be part of the input process, assuming that this does not get passed
if my
this evening?
participation could be beneficial in drafting something that would be, I would submit to your request. I certainly could meet, and we would have participated. I honestly had no idea that this had not my honest answer, I thought it had died at the last hearing, where there was a considerable amount of objections to and for many citizens. And it wasn't until just recently that I even understood that it was up for grabs again. So I would be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hirschman. I am waiting for another card to come forward. So please introduce yourself.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me. My name's Julie Donnelly. I live at 15305 Sioux View Drive. And I do take offense to the fact that nobody knew, because I hand-delivered with my neighbors when we found out about this over 1,000 flyers to the Hillside people in my car every night. So we tried to let people know, and there was, back in December, over 300 people were opposed to what was presented because, we were trying to generate information on this and bring people here. And also, I want to say that the ordinance that we're proposing allows for fencing in unrestricted areas for playgrounds, et cetera, so that shouldn't be an issue. It's being addressed in the current proposal.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Vice Mayor Leonardis.
So, Ms. Donnelly, obviously we've received some feedback here this evening, and there were some points brought forward by a number of speakers that maybe this could use a little more work. Do you see, I know your husband thought we were pretty much there, but do you see, after listening to the other speakers, any opportunities for perhaps a better ordinance for the overall community?
I think that you have the two people who, one on one end of the spectrum and one on the other end, working together collaboratively for the past few months. This thing back in December, this was a full house of people when this came up. So I think that they've worked really hard together to come to where we are today, and I think it makes sense with what we're proposing.
Thank you.
There's always room to look at other things, but I think that what we have is a sound and logical proposal.
And were you opposed to the first version that came forward?
To me, it didn't make sense. When she was saying that the language was hard to understand, I think what they've put together, they've gone through each of the bullet points and tried to make it so that it was fair to both sides.
So I mean, in a year ago, were you opposed to the ordinance that was brought a year ago?
I was opposed to the ordinance as written.
And why was that?
It didn't make sense. I mean, the parcel that we live on, the wildlife corridors, I mean, all that's very important for us to be restricted for the size of our parcel. I do have 3 dogs, which I want to have them be able to be in an area but be protected from the wildlife, but not be, right next to my house. So I think some of the things that they've gone through, they spent a lot of time doing that those make more sense, and we're in a better position today with what we're trying to propose.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
See no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anybody else wish to speak on this item? Seeing nobody coming forward, I'll close the public testimony and come back up to council for more questions, discussion, motions. Councilmember Jensen.
I'll just begin discussion. It's not going to be a motion. As I've listened to the input at the December meeting tonight and read the correspondence, more and more I have thought about some of the comments that Mr. Hirschman actually made, that our regulatory process now examines fences, it examines construction, examines setbacks. So I'm wondering what we cure by this ordinance, if anything. But more importantly than that, my issue with the ordinance is, given that the council set as one of its strategic priorities streamlining land use processes to make things easier and less expensive for business owners, landowners, everyone else, it seems inconsistent with that priority to adopt an ordinance that creates a brand new permitting process. that's never existed, that we have to go through and figure out, develop a permit, just like we did with the cats. But that was different. We actually had a problem that we were addressing, that was part of it, and that was a compromise. Here, we've created a new regulatory process when our priority is to try as much as possible to streamline and eliminate those processes where they're not needed. And it just strikes me that it's not necessarily needed here. So why would we adopt an ordinance that creates that? I totally, absolutely agree that wildlife need to move in the hillsides. I walk around, ride around our hillsides all the time and enjoy seeing the wildlife. I do see them cross the road a lot. I see what people have done with their large properties, and some of what I've seen done I think is fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily match what's now going to be required here. So I wonder also, how many properties are we affecting while leaving in place all kinds of existing properties that don't necessarily comply with this, but have used creative ways to come up with landscaping, use open fences, put hedges in, and still allow the wildlife to move. So my difficulty in looking at this is, I think there still are considerations. Whenever you work with and I appreciate all the work that's been done on this by the residents. Thank you very much for the time and effort. But in any kind of enterprise where you work in what becomes sort of an insulated process, you get wed to the product and you don't think about necessarily what other people are thinking about. And this kind of a hearing brings up other considerations that maybe the council ought to take into account before it goes ahead and makes a determination one way or the other on the ordinance tonight.
Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So obviously there's a diversity of needs, a diversity of opinions on this, and I look at it in terms of what is absolutely necessary. We heard about things like glass fences and clear fences that animals will run into. We heard about chain link fences. I don't know where we should go with this evening, but I will say that there's new information that was brought forth to me that I would be willing to postpone the vote on this item this evening, because I think it does require more examination, and it's going to be impossible to please everybody with one ordinance, but I would be looking for perhaps a better or more improved version of this ordinance based on some of the information I received this evening. So I like the idea of perhaps the policy committee taking a look at this and give an opportunity for them to weigh in on it, and perhaps the public to weigh in on it as well moving forward. But I'm interested in hearing what the other council members have to say.
Councilmember Sayak.
So actually, before comment, I do have a couple questions of staff. So the first, we heard about the permitting. I recall in December, some of the concerns was the actual cost to the permitting and the process and the layers of regulation attached to that. So can you clarify what would the cost be, and would this be something that could occur over the counter?
Cost would be based on time spent to review the application, and we would determine what an appropriate deposit would be for the review. Over the counter, I guess that's always possible, but if there's information that staff needs to confirm that the plan meets the ordinance, then we may make requests for additional information or work with the applicant to modify the plans.
Okay, if I may follow up.
Go ahead.
And maybe I'm reading it too simplistically. When I look at this version, what I'm looking at is that we're trying to emphasize a wildlife corridor based on the setbacks. And so, and again, I want to make sure I'm not looking at this too simply, but wouldn't it just be looking at the parcel of land, figuring out what the setbacks are, and then that would determine where the fence would go, and you'd look at what type of material it is?
Yes, it could be that simple. Obviously, there's some complications that could come up if we pull up information that shows a possible riparian corridor and may need to work with it. The complexities of every property sort of infinite, but in the probably a high percentage of plans, they could be over the counter. And based on my experience with similar regulations in other jurisdictions, they frequently were over the counter.
Okay, and then again, one of the things that I'm curious about is the approximate cost. Are we, without being able to say exactly what that is, are we talking about could you give me a ballpark?
Thank you, Joel Paulson, Community Development Director. We couldn't give you a ballpark because we haven't gone through this process yet. Obviously, it will get refined and more efficient as we move forward. So the first couple we'll probably do as a trial basis and figure out what the timing is. But each one will be looked at individually, and as Mr. Mullen mentioned, some will be more complex than others. But it could definitely be, you know, a couple $100 to $500 depending on the complexity and the time spent. We're currently going through a fee study, which will be brought back to the council, and depending on the action this evening and going forward on this, that item would be in the fee study for council consideration, and you could decide at that point whether you thought a different fee was reasonable.
Let me follow up on the permit. Maybe I misread. I thought that the permits were only needed if you wanted to try to build a fence in the controlled area. Does anybody wants to build a fence on their yard, if it's not in the controlled area, need a permit?
Permit required only in the regulated fence area.
Regulated, yeah, that's the right term. Okay. Councilmember Jensen.
Following up on the concept of over-the-counter, it's on page 7 of the proposed ordinance, section 29.40.034, and I'm going to get this wrong because it's paragraph A, subparagraph A, it's actually B11. And it's talking about the permitting process and regulations for the, quote, regulated area, which we don't now have. We'd have to create one. And 11 says notices. Noticing shall comply with the public noticing procedures of section 29.20.480 of the town code. So presumably, if you're going to provide notice of construction of a fence in the regulated area, then there is an objection procedure and a hearing procedure. So you cannot do it over the counter if you are noticing.
That's correct. That's a good catch. Correct? I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll add a couple thoughts then. As you know, I do have concerns with this. I was under the impression that we had worked with a broader spectrum of people in the hills. I guess I hate to say it, but I feel like a flatlander, and I don't feel like I understand the hills at all, or the needs of the hills, or what the difference in the zonings are, or the difference in the size of the properties and how much that makes a difference. I'm not feeling very comfortable that I know what the results of this ordinance, if passed as it is, would be like. As I mentioned, you know, one acre lot seems a little bit arbitrary to me. If you take off, you know, one thing I'd be interested in is trying to understand, if you, let's say we're 1.1 acre lot, just over an acre, if you take off 20 or 30 feet, what percent of that person's property is now, you know, you've sort of taken their rights away, I guess, versus I'm hearing, you know, 4.3 acres, it seems fine to take off the 20 or 30 acres. What I'm not sure about is 1 acre the right break point, for example. I'm also concerned that, well, I sort of said it, that I'm concerned that there may be more objections to this that we just haven't, people just aren't aware. I think we saw that with the feral cats. We actually passed the ordinance the first time, and then when we tried to have a second reading, actually, I don't think we even got to second reading. People started figuring it out and coming out. You know, we do have a well-practiced process of noticing, but sometimes it falls short. I don't know how many times we've heard people say, I didn't know about something. So I'm of the mind that we should probably send this back to policy committee, because I'll be on policy committee and I'd like to understand it it better. I thought there would be more understanding in the staff report. So I'll stop with my thoughts there. I saw Councilmember Spector next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, first of all, I want to thank staff. I want to thank the members of the community who worked on this, the Sierra Club and the other organizations who have written into us. When you talk about what are the interests here, well, the first interest are the animals in our hillsides. And then you have to look at, so if that's your goal, to protect the animals in the hillsides, then fencing is a significant issue. And it's a significant issue because depending upon where you place that fencing, it could be determinative of whether the animals run into the street or they stay on the hillsides. And I think that is very, very significant. I was looking forward to having this ordinance come back. I appreciate the staff. I appreciate that there are those in our community who worked on this for, seems like forever. I mean, it's not only the past year, but this has been an issue in this town for a long time. I'm not deaf. I hear that, this may not be passed this evening, but it does give me concern. As far as, the noticing, I neglected to ask staff what their noticing process was on this. But very often when I don't know about things in my neighborhood, it's because I just didn't bother to read about it. And sometimes I know about it because I've made an effort. And so I'm not convinced that the reason people don't know about this issue is because there's been a problem with the noticing. Then we have a woman who drove around with 1,000 flyers herself. So I am not convinced that there is a noticing issue. I am convinced that we have an issue with protecting the animals in our hillside. I appreciated the fact that individuals representing two extremes of opinions on this issue worked together for a year to come up with this ordinance. If I had my druthers, I would take this ordinance, tweak it a little bit, and approve it this evening.
Councilmember Sack.
Okay, I'm going to actually try a motion to see where we're at. And I understand the concerns that have been raised. And I'll be the first to say that there is no policy that's going to be perfect. And what happened in December was a proposal that severely restricted what you could do with your land. And the way I read the proposal that we have before us is we are looking at what is the minimum that is necessary for wildlife animals to move from one place to another in a safe way. What's the minimum amount that we can give them a corridor so that they can access other parts of the community? And that, in my way, that is the minimum amount we're looking at to provide that safe transportation for them. So I don't think it's going to be as cumbersome as the fear is. The only time you will need permitting is if you are in that restricted area. And if there are other issues that need to be looked at, like riparian areas, that has to be looked at anyway. So I feel comfortable with what we have. I understand that nothing is perfect, but given the compromises and given the time that has been spent to put this proposal forward, I'd like to see it approved. And so I'm going to make a motion to consider the proposed amendments and introduce the drafted ordinance by title only to amend Chapter 6 and Chapter 29 of the Town Code regarding fences, hedges, and walls, which is contained in Attachment 14.
Councilmember Spector.
I am going to second the motion for the reasons stated by the motion maker and also for the reasons I stated just a little while ago.
Ms. Perfetti.
Thank you. I just want to clarify that I believe Attachment 18 is the current version of the ordinance that was provided to you in the addendum.
Actually, thank you for that clarification, attachment 18. And actually, if I may, I'd like to amend my motion to include the language, the one sentence that was requested by Dr. Weissman and Mr. Donnelly, as well as the requested change in material against transparent fences that was in our addendum.
And the seconder of the motion accepts both of those.
If I may weigh in on that, because I would have to disagree with adding that section in. The two speakers are confusing the two together. Your ordinance is a law. It's a rule of law. It's the law that has to be abided by. It has to be abided by all property owners. CC&Rs is a contract. It's a completely different. It's a contract between the property owners. With the language that you're putting in there, you're saying that they don't have to conflict with each other. One can be more restrictive than the other one. You always have to comply with the most restrictive one. An example could be there could be CC&Rs that say no fences are allowed whatsoever. You just can't have fences if you want to live here. Our code's going to prevail over that and allow them to put fences in there when the contract says you couldn't have done that. So if you're putting it in this one section, how are we going to do the rest of them? Because there's other CC&Rs throughout the town that might say setbacks have to be 20 feet when our setbacks are 15 feet. So you're taking contracts away from people. They still have to comply with the law. Every single sentence, whether height, setbacks, fences, they'll have to comply with our law. But there are times when CC&Rs are more restrictive, and you'd be tying the hands or probably end up in litigation because the contract, just because we say it prevails, doesn't mean the contract prevails between two separate parties.
Okay. So, Mr. Schultz, thank you for that clarification. So I'm going to repeat the motion is including attachment 18, which is the most recent, and the only change is to include the prohibition against transparent fences that is in our addendum.
Councilmember Spector.
And I agree as a seconder of the motion.
Okay. Further comments? Vice Mayor Leonardis?
There was a speaker that mentioned bringing in the regular fence heights to the state code. Is that included in this motion? Just wanted clarification. That's a yes? Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll make a comment. Like I said, I think the thing that I'm most concerned about is the 1 acre. I just don't have a feel for whether that's the right place to set this at. I have a feeling there are streets, sort of dense streets on the edge of the wildlife areas that have lots one after another that are more than an acre that back up to a large open space. So I just have a feeling that the 1 acre doesn't make sense for those. Maybe it does. I don't think I have enough information to support the motion at this point. Vice Mayor Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. There were some comments made by Ms. Quintana about gate heights, I think, as well as bringing fences all the way to the edge of a property line on a street or something to that effect. And I was just wondering if that would warrant more exploration. In other words, I appreciate the amount of work and the amount of effort that's gone into this thing so far, and I feel like we're close, but I feel like if we spend a little bit more time, we can maybe come up with something even better. And I hate to send people away unsatisfied this evening, but I feel like we've made significant progress since last December, and it's all been in kind of the right direction, but I feel like there are other things that could possibly be addressed that, and I know it's going to be hard to get a one-size-fits-all, but I'm still literally on the fence of this fence ordinance.
Okay, if no further comments, I will call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
Looks like it fails 3-2 with Councilmember Jensen, Vice Mayor Leonardis, and Mayor Rennie opposed. Okay. Would anybody like to make an alternate motion or comments? Councilmember Jensen.
Okay, I will make an alternate motion, again, thanking those who've worked so hard on this. Appreciate your efforts, but sometimes a little more information and a little more discussion doesn't really hurt, and I think this ordinance could benefit from both of those things. So with that in mind, I would like to move to send it to the Policy Committee for consideration of issues such as the appropriate lot size, to consider whether it ought to be broken down by zone or size of the lot, how to consider CC&Rs. Thank you, Mr. Schultz. I think you've answered that question. What materials make sense, what don't. I'd personally like to understand how many lots potentially this ordinance would actually affect. Could we make changes or understand better the potential cost or noticing requirements or consequences of the noticing requirements? Should the permitting process be contained within an eventual ordinance? And I'm expecting there will be eventually an ordinance. I hope so. And get input that we don't already have from those various interested groups, Audubon Society, wildlife groups, etc., as to what we should consider, and take a harder look at those Saratoga best practices or their ordinances that we didn't really look at tonight that we got in our desk item, just to see what the approaches other communities have taken and whether those would work for us.
Okay, I have a motion. Would anybody like to second?
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Further discussion, Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question of staff. First of all, this ordinance, this has been around a really long time, but it seems like somewhere along the way, because it's in an ordinance, it went to the Planning Commission before it got here. So that's a question. Is that true?
That's correct.
All right. And then secondly, assuming that this does go back to that goes to the Policy Committee, and I always have a challenge with ordinances going to the Policy Committee as opposed to going to the Planning Commission and the Council. But putting that aside, assuming it does go to the Policy Committee, how fast can we do it so we don't have to sit around for another year?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Spector. I'd love to give you an answer of how quickly that could happen. The reality is, I think we have a meeting coming up here this week or next week, this week. And so then the next meeting wouldn't be until November, so we'd have to look at that. That would be the absolute soonest to begin the discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, further comment? I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Motion passes 3-2 with Councilmember Sack and Councilmember Spector opposed. Town Manager?
Just for the consideration of the town council, we were wondering, since we have so many fence questions that are pending in our flatland area, if the portion of the ordinance that pertains to our flatlands might be acceptable to the town council for adoption this evening.
Okay, Councilmember Jensen.
So to Mr. Schultz, can we bifurcate the discussion and approve that portion that has to do with the flatlands or not?
No, we'd have to bring it back, but we could, if you could do a motion to continue this ordinance hearing to a specific date,
Okay.
which,
I'm happy to do that.
so we don't have to re-notice, and then we could just take that and separate it out completely as a separate ordinance.
Assuming that the policy committee can consider this in November or in a special meeting, does it make sense to bring this back in December, Mr. Paulson or Mr. Schultz?
I think we could, if you want to set a specific date, the first meeting in December, if at a minimum, we'll bring back just the issue of the height limits in the flat area. December 6th, is it?
So I will move that we continue this matter to a date certain at our council meeting of December 4th. So those of you that are interested, please note on your calendar that we'll hear it on December 4th, and we'll at least have an update, and at that point, hopefully can consider the flatland fence restrictions or lack thereof. So that's my motion to
Okay,
December
do we
4th.
have a second for this?
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Comments, Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question, this whole agenda item would be coming back on December 4th, correct?
Not necessarily. If it hasn't vetted enough at the policy committee to bring enough back to you, my understanding would be then the only thing that would be coming back to you in December would be just the ordinance to eliminate the height limit in the flatlands, unless you want it to come back for another full discussion.
So my intention was to bring it back for a full discussion, at which point we can at least tell people who aren't on the policy committee where we are, share the information that we have received, and then have a discussion. And it could be based upon what the policy committee learns or discusses, that it determines that this ordinance as presented is just fine, but we don't have, the people I think supporting this motion to continue don't feel they have that information right now.
Is that the same understanding by the seconder?
Yes.
Okay. Councilmember Spector?
With that explanation, I will support the motion.
Okay, any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Seeing none, passes unanimously. Okay, do you need anything else from us? That was our last agenda item. Then with that, we're adjourned.